Damien Forsyth walked into the building on a Monday morning like he owned it. Which, technically, he didn't. But no one had told him that yet. I watched him from the corridor outside the conference room. This man in his late 30s, tailored jacket, hair product that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill, scrolling his phone with the kind of casual confidence that only comes from never having been told no. He was the CEO's son-in-law. He had married into Meridian Bioformulations 8 months ago, and now, apparently, he was going to run it. My name is Clara Whitfield. I was 31 years old when I joined Meridian as a junior formulation chemist. That was 19 years ago. I want you to understand what 19 years looks like from the inside. It doesn't feel like a long time when you love the work. It feels like Tuesday, then Wednesday, then a decade has passed, and you've barely noticed because you were too busy solving problems that no one else wanted to touch. I had worked through 2 CEOs, 4 restructures, 1 near bankruptcy, and a regulatory crisis that had nearly cost us our operating license. I had stayed late when everyone else went home. I had come in on Christmas Eve when a batch failed, and no one else answered the phone. I had done all of that because I believed in what we were building, a pharmaceutical compounding company that genuinely served patients in regional New Zealand who couldn't access standard medications, people with rare conditions, children who needed custom doses, elderly patients in rest homes in Southland who needed formulations their bodies could actually tolerate. That was the company I had joined at 22. That was the company I had given everything to. Damien Forsyth did not care about any of that. He was appointed Chief Operations Officer in March. No announcement, no formal process. One afternoon, the outgoing COO, a woman named Patricia, who had mentored me for 6 years, quietly cleared her desk. The following morning, Damien had her office, her parking space, and a new title on a plaque that someone had installed overnight. When I asked HR whether there had been a selection process, the woman across the desk looked at her screen and said the position had been filled internally. I said, "He's never worked in pharmaceutical manufacturing." She said, "He has a background in hospitality management." I waited for her to laugh. She didn't. The first all-staff meeting Damien ran was in April. He stood at the front of the room and told us that Meridian had been operating from a scarcity mindset and that he intended to shift us toward a growth-first culture. He used the word pivot 4 times in 11 minutes. I counted. He talked about scaling revenue streams and optimizing client touchpoints. He did not once mention patients. He did not once mention compounding accuracy, regulatory compliance, or the fact that we were producing medications that went directly into human bodies. One of our senior compounding technicians, a quiet man named Rob, who had been with the company longer than me, raised his hand and asked about the new production targets Damien had distributed the week before. The targets required us to increase batch output by 40% within 6 months. Rob said, "With our current clean room capacity, that timeline creates a contamination risk." Damien smiled. "That's the kind of fixed mindset we're moving away from, Rob." Rob looked at me. I looked at Rob. Neither of us said anything else. That was April. By June, I had submitted 3 written concerns to the operations team about the production schedule. Each one was acknowledged with a 2-line reply that said, "My feedback had been noted." By July, Damien had reorganized the quality assurance reporting structure so that QA flagged to him directly instead of to the technical director. By August, he had removed the pre-batch review sign-off that our Chief Formulation Officer, Dr. Ngaio Parada, had implemented 15 years earlier after a dispensing error that had hospitalized a patient. Dr. Parada had retired the previous year. I was, at that point, the person who understood her system most deeply. I had helped build it. I had spent 3 years refining the verification protocols with her, cross-referencing them against MedSafe guidelines, stress-testing them against edge cases, until they were as close to foolproof as a human system could be. Damien called them legacy red tape. I called them the reason we hadn't hurt anyone in 15 years. In September, I was called into his office at 9:14 in the morning. I remember the time because I had just come from a batch verification and I still had my lab coat over my arm. His PA had rung my desk while I was mid-process and said it was urgent. I had handed off to my colleague and walked down the corridor with the particular feeling you get when something is about to happen that you cannot yet name. Damien was sitting behind Patricia's old desk. He had redecorated. There was a motivational print on the wall behind him that said, "Disrupt or be disrupted." Patricia had kept a photograph of her grandchildren in the same spot. He didn't offer me a seat. He said, "Clara, I want to be up front with you. This isn't personal." I had heard those 4 words before. They are always the warning sign. Nothing that comes next is ever not personal. He told me that Meridian was undergoing a structural realignment, that my role as Principal Formulation Chemist was being disestablished, that my position and 2 others in the technical team were surplus to the new operational model. He handed me an envelope and said HR had prepared my final entitlements and that I was welcome to use the rest of the day to collect my things. I looked at the envelope. I looked at him. I had 19 years in this building. I had worked through a near bankruptcy, stayed through the hard years, turned down 2 offers from larger companies because I believed in what Meridian was doing. I had trained half the technical staff currently working in this building. I had developed formulation protocols that were still in use today, methodologies that we had refined together over years and that underpinned everything Meridian produced. I said, "Are you aware of the IP assignment provisions in my original employment contract?" He blinked. "Sorry? My employment contract from 2006. The intellectual property provisions. I'd recommend you review them before finalizing anything." He gave me a patient smile, the kind you give someone you've decided isn't worth arguing with. "HR has everything in order, Clara." I nodded. I picked up my lab coat. I said, "Have a good morning, Damien." I walked back to my desk. I packed my personal items into a single box, a photograph of my family, a small succulent I'd had for 6 years, a mug that said, "Keep calm and check your references." I said goodbye to Rob, who hugged me without saying anything. I said goodbye to 3 others. I did not cry, not because I wasn't devastated, but because I had learned something over 19 years in this industry. The moment you show someone you are broken, they stop seeing what you built and only see the breaking. I walked out of the building at 10:48 a.m. with my box and my lab coat, and 19 years of knowledge that no one had thought to ask about. The drive home took 40 minutes. I spent most of it very quiet. What I had not told Damien what I had decided, somewhere between his office and my desk, to let him discover for himself, was something that had been true since before I ever walked through Meridian's doors. In 2003, I was 22 years old and doing my honors year in pharmaceutical science at the University of Otago. For my research project, I developed a stability testing methodology for complex multi-compound formulations, specifically for medications that required precise interaction modeling between active ingredients that didn't ordinarily play well together. The methodology addressed a known gap in how small compounding operations handled batch consistency for high-risk formulations. My supervisor at the time, Dr. Helen Marsh, encouraged me to formalize the work. I spent another 14 months refining it after graduation. In early 2005, I filed a patent application in my own name, my maiden name, Clara Tennant. The patent was granted in 2006. It covered a specific class of stability testing and interaction modeling protocols for pharmaceutical compounding operations. In November 2006, I joined Meridian Bioformulations as a junior chemist. I had been married 3 months earlier and was using my married name, Whitfield. In the complexity of starting a new job and a new life simultaneously, I had not updated the patent registration. It remained under Clara Tennant. In 2009, then CEO David Larkin had approached me about licensing my methodology for use in Meridian's compounding operations. He had found the patent through a literature search and traced it back to me. I remember sitting in his office, a different energy, while he explained that Meridian wanted to formalize what was already, in practice, embedded in our processes. We negotiated a licensing agreement. It was not a large sum at the time. It was a formal arrangement that acknowledged I held the intellectual property and that Meridian was an authorized licensee. That licensing agreement had been renewed 3 times since then, most recently in 2021. It sat in a file in my personal records at home. It also, I was fairly confident, sat in Meridian's legal records somewhere, though I suspected Damien had never read it. Or if it had been mentioned to him, it hadn't registered as significant. The The licensing agreement expired in December of that year, 4 months after Damien fired me. I did not call a lawyer that afternoon. I went home, made a cup of tea, rang my mother, and did not tell her everything. I sat in my garden for a while. I thought about Dr. Parada and her verification protocols, and about Rob's face when Damien had told him his concerns represented a fixed mindset. I thought about the patients in Southland. I thought about what the 40% production increase without proper QA sign-off was going to mean, eventually, for someone who depended on a medication being exactly right. I thought about a lot of things. Then I called my lawyer. Her name was Jo Finlayson, and she had handled the patent filing for me back in 2005. She still had all the original documentation. When I explained the situation, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Clara, they're operating under a license that expires in 4 months." "Yes. And they've just terminated the person who holds the patent." "Yes." Another pause. Did they know? Damien didn't. Whether the CEO knew, I honestly don't know. The original agreement was made under David Larkin. There's been a lot of leadership change since then. Jo said, "All right, let's talk about your options. I want to be careful here, because what followed was not a revenge story. I am not a person who wanted to see Meridian fail. I had spent 19 years trying to make it succeed. The company served real people with real needs. What I wanted, what I had always wanted, was for the work to be done properly, for the patients to be safe, and for the people who built things to be treated with basic dignity. What I did was this. I did not renew the license. I notified Meridian's legal team, formally and in writing, in late November, that the licensing agreement for the tenant formulation methodology would expire on December 31st, and that I did not intend to renew under current terms. I noted that any continued use of the methodology after that date without a new agreement would constitute infringement of my registered patent. I attached the original patent documentation, the original licensing agreement, and all 3 renewal records. I am told the email landed in the CEO's inbox, Damien's father-in-law, a man named Jeffrey Holt, at 3:17 on a Tuesday afternoon. I am told his response internally was not calm. I was not in the building to see it. But Rob texted me at 4:52 that same afternoon and said simply, "They're asking for your number." I did not reply to Meridian directly. Jo handled all of it. What emerged from the following 3 weeks was a series of increasingly urgent communications from Meridian's legal team, who had clearly spent those weeks going through their own records and realizing, with gathering dread, exactly what they had lost. The tenant formulation methodology was not a minor component of Meridian's operations. Over 19 years, it had been integrated into their primary batch verification process, their high-risk formulation protocols, and the stability testing documentation they submitted to MedSafe for license compliance. Removing it was not a simple matter of finding an alternative. The methodology was embedded in how they did almost everything that mattered. Damien, I was told secondhand, had been very quiet during the legal briefing. He had apparently asked, at one point, who Clara Tennant was. Jeffrey had apparently not answered him immediately. In January, Jo and I sat across a table from Meridian's legal team and their new technical director. They had replaced me with someone from Auckland who, to his credit, clearly understood the situation and looked deeply uncomfortable. Jeffrey attended the meeting himself. He was a man in his 60s, measured, not unkind. He had not been the one to fire me, and I believed he understood, by that point, what had happened and why. Damien was not in the room. The negotiation took 2 sessions. What we agreed upon was a new licensing arrangement at a substantially revised rate that reflected the actual commercial value of the methodology, not the nominal sum that had been set in 2009. Jo had done her homework thoroughly. The new arrangement also included a formal acknowledgement of my authorship and a consultancy provision that gave me input into how the methodology was applied. I want to be clear. I was not trying to extract maximum damage. I was trying to ensure the company could keep operating safely, because the alternative, Meridian scrambling to replace foundational protocols in a rush, cutting corners, making errors, was the worst outcome for the patients they served. I negotiated firmly, but I was not cruel about it. What I cared about most was the QA sign-off process. As a condition of the new licensing agreement, I requested that the pre-batch verification protocols Dr. Parada and I had developed be formally reinstated and documented as non-negotiable operating procedure. Meridian's new technical director, to his credit, agreed immediately. He had been trying to reinstate them since he'd arrived, apparently. Damien had blocked it each time. Damien resigned in February. I don't know the details. I don't particularly need to. In March, I was invited to speak at the New Zealand Pharmaceutical Compounding Symposium in Wellington. The session topic was methodology, documentation, and IP protection in small to medium compounding operations. A subject that had, apparently, become rather timely. I prepared my talk carefully. I had spent months thinking about what the real lesson was, not just for me, but for others in the industry. I stood at the front of a room full of people who did this work, who understood what it meant to compound a medication for a child who needed something that didn't exist in a standard form, who knew the weight of getting it right. I talked about the tenant methodology. I talked about the patent process and what it had meant, eventually, to have that documentation in order. I talked about what it looked like when institutional knowledge walked out of a building in a cardboard box, and nobody had bothered to understand what they were losing. Afterward, a young woman came up to me. She was maybe 24, early in her career, with the particular intensity of someone who had come into this field because she genuinely cared. She asked me how I had stayed calm. She asked me how I hadn't just her word exploded. I thought about it for a moment. I said, because exploding would have been about me, and the work was never about me. She looked at me for a while. Then she wrote something in her notebook. Rob came to my talk. He was sitting in the third row with a coffee he'd somehow snuck past the venue's no outside drinks policy. Afterward, he told me that the new technical director had bought him a better coffee machine for the lab. Small things. They matter. I think about what happened at Meridian often, not with bitterness. I am surprised to find that is actually true, but with a kind of clear-eyed understanding of how these situations unfold and how they could be different. What struck me most, looking back, was not Damien's arrogance or even Jeffrey's failure of oversight. What struck me was how completely the people in that building had stopped asking the fundamental question, what is this place for? A pharmaceutical compounding company is not, at its core, a revenue growth vehicle. It is a place where people with specific, often urgent, medical needs come because the standard options have failed them. Every protocol, every sign-off process, every seemingly tedious verification step exists because, at some point in history, something went wrong when it wasn't there. The knowledge of why those processes exist doesn't live in an operations manual. It lives in the people who were present when things went wrong and built the safeguards afterward. When you fire those people without understanding what they carry, you don't just lose an employee. You lose the institutional memory that keeps other people safe. Damien came in with a hospitality background and a family connection, and the unshakable belief that confidence was a substitute for competence. I have met people like him in every industry. They are not always malicious. Sometimes, they are simply people who have never been genuinely accountable for consequences, and so they have never learned to be afraid of the right things. I am not angry at him. I genuinely am not, and I've examined that feeling carefully enough to trust it. What I feel, more than anything, is tired. Tired of a culture that treats longevity as inertia, that mistakes loyalty for obsolescence, that looks at someone who has given 2 decades to a place and sees only a line item to be cut. If I could tell anyone anything from this experience, it would be these things. Document your work. Not defensively, not with one eye on a future dispute, but because the knowledge you carry has value beyond your own memory of it. File the patent. Keep the records. Make sure what you have built has a form that exists outside of other people's assumptions about who you are. Know the value of what you've created. This is harder than it sounds, especially if you are someone who works because you love the work, rather than because you're tracking your leverage. I never thought of my methodology as a commercial asset. I thought of it as a tool for doing the job better. Both things were true, and I should have understood both things sooner. Stay connected to your purpose. The months after I was fired were genuinely hard. Not financially, the settlement was more than adequate, but emotionally. I had built my professional identity around a place and a mission, and that place had made clear it didn't value what I'd contributed. What kept me steady was remembering that the mission-safe medication for people who needed it was bigger than Meridian. It existed outside of that building. I could still serve it. And finally, the people who underestimate you are doing you a favor, though it never feels that way at the time. Damien looked at me and saw overhead. He fired me, without knowing my name. The irony is that his certainty, his absolute confidence that he understood the value of everything in that building, is precisely what created the situation that followed. If he had known what he was dealing with, he would have been more careful. He wasn't careful because he was sure. Being underestimated is not comfortable, but it does leave your hands free. My name is Clara Tennant-Whitfield. I am 50 years old. I hold a patent that has been licensed to 9 compounding operations across New Zealand and Australia. I consult to 3 of them directly. I am working on a second methodology, this time in collaboration with a research team at Otago, and this time I am making very sure that everyone in the room knows exactly whose name is on the work. Last spring, I got a card in the mail from a woman in Invercargill. Her daughter has a rare metabolic condition and requires a compounded formulation that uses stability testing protocols derived from my original methodology. The card said simply that the medication had been consistent for 3 years and that her daughter was doing well. I kept the card on my desk, next to the coffee mug, next to the photograph of my family. Some things are more important than a parking space and a plaque on a door, and some names, it turns out, are more permanent than the people who forgot to ask what they meant.